David Hallauer, Meadowlark Extension District, and for this tailgate talk, we're going to talk just a little bit about weed and brush control. Now, obviously, we'd all like to look behind us in a lot of cases and see just green grass out there after we've grazed, after we'd hayed, whatever the case may be. But that is not always possible. In fact, Mother Nature has a huge bit to do with that, but our management has a lot to do with it as well. So over the next few sections here, we're going to talk about multiple ways that we can integrate what is known as an integrated weed management system. And that will certainly include herbicide use for brush and weed control on pasture, rangeland, and hayfield, but it's also going to include some other thoughts as well. So let's get started and take a look at what some of those ways are that we can tie a lot of different things together to get the weed control we want so that we can end up having a clean field just like this. Before we even get to the point of trying to implement the facets of an integrated weed management program, I think there's a couple things that we need to cover. And first of all, we need to understand what is a weed. Now, we often phrase or define a weed as a plant that is out of place. So basically something that doesn't fit. Now, that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Different people graze different things, different species graze different types of plants. But when it all comes down to it, there are certainly plants that fit very well in the grazing system and those that maybe fit less well, if you will. So the first step is really a proper identification. Now you can do that a lot of different ways. You can bring plants into the extension office or send us pictures and we'll either take care of them through the office, or if we don't know what they are, we can send them to the KU herbarium, we can send them to the K-State herbarium. Both of those places do a really good job of identifying weeds. The range conservationists with the Natural Resource Conservation Service do an awesome job of identifying plants. Worked with many of them over the years, and they do a phenomenal job of being able to pick out plants. Our own range specialist at K-State, Walt Fick, if one of the herbariums can't help me out or I need something in a more immediate manner, he can really be a good resource as well. So there's lots of different places we can go. There's books. This particular book here, Weeds of the Great Plains, is from the University of Nebraska. It does a really nice job of kind of spelling out what weeds are and gives a lot of different characteristic information, as well as even whether that plant's poisonous or not. So that's a good resource. There's lots and lots of online resources as well. So there's no shortage of resources available to help you get that plant identified. Because in many cases, if I were to hold up all three of these plants right here, could you tell me which one was a weed? And again, in many cases, that depends on what plant or what species we're grazing and how that's going to work. This is a verbena species, and in most cases, we find it to be somewhat invasive, maybe not terribly, but somewhat invasive. If you can see the pasture behind me here a little bit, you can see that there's a number of plants out here, but they're really probably not taking up a whole lot of space. We have lots of weeds that are like that. Some of the ironweeds, for instance, maybe don't take up a lot of space, and if they're not getting invasive, maybe we're not going to worry about them too much. So, we don't know for sure in many cases whether we even need to control that. This is Illinois bundleflower, and in many cases, it's not terribly invasive. In fact, it may be beneficial to some species in some cases, and so, probably not one we worry about too much. And then this leaf is from a compass plant. It'll get a big, tall yellow flower on it, and this plant is actually very difficult to find in any sort of range situation because cattle actually seek it out. So if we had those three plants and we were just indiscriminately spraying, wouldn't make a lot of sense because we probably got two of those three plants that really aren't doing all that much damage. So is it really a weed? That's the first question we need to ask. One of the second things that goes along with that is what species of livestock are we grazing? Research has shown that in the Flint Hills of Kansas, where we're grazing warm season native range, that maybe up to 20% of that diet might consist of palatable forbs, those broadleaf plants out there that are not grass. So again, do we really need to control them all? In some cases, they're even higher quality than the grasses we have out there. Now, let's say it truly is a weed. Let's say it truly is something that we don't want out there and we want to do something about it. The second thing I think we need to ask is it economically important to control it? Is this a spot spray type of situation, or is this a whole field spray type of situation? Do we even need to do anything at all? Is it noxious? Because if it is, we have to control it. Noxious weed law in the state of Kansas says that we need to get it taken care of. So we need to implement some level of control program at that point. But if it's not, and it's not economically important, maybe our options change just a little bit. And I think that then we ask ourselves, why is it even here? Now that can be a pretty loaded question, right? In some cases, we have it there because we've had multiple years of drought. And we opened up the canopy a little bit, and all of a sudden that plant started to creep in. And so maybe if we manage out of that, we get a few good years of good rainfall patterns, maybe we manage ourselves out of that list just a little bit. Have we used an appropriate stocking rate over time? Do we need to change that stocking rate based on the number of factors, whether it be animal size or the type of animal we're grazing or the season that we're grazing in? Are we grazing in an appropriate manner, or is that overgrazing causing us to introduce plants into that community that maybe we don't want. We see that a lot in haying situations. We have to hay at a certain time because that's when moisture, equipment, whatever allows us to. And at that point, we're really at the mercy of Mother Nature on the backside after that hay crop is off of there to make sure that those plants recover as they're supposed to. And if weather isn't conducive to that, they don't. So if we don't give time for adequate grazing, rest and recovery is very important. If we're not allowing adequate time in the fall for those plants to recover, our management practices, is there differences in weather patterns that are resulting in the issues that we have? All those things come into play, and all of those things, is it a weed and do we need to do anything about it, are the first two questions that we really ought to start with before we get started in that weed management program. So let's say that it is a weed and we decide that we're going to try to implement a control program, or maybe we want to learn just a little bit more about what that particular plant is. Another good resource that I want to show you is the 2020 KSU Chemical Weed Control Guide. This is available online or through any of our extension offices. You can pick that up, you can take a look at it, but if you do pick it up, I want to reference a chart in there that I think is pretty interesting on page 120. Now it starts out like this at the top. It's got all of this information about different plants. It talks in there about what the life cycle of that plant is, whether it is an annual or whether it's a perennial. There are differences in how we implement a control program at that point. It talks about whether it's cool season or warm season. When is it going to grow? Is it going to be early in the spring, into the fall? Is it going to be during the summer? Those are things that are important to know as we start to implement different control type programs. And then there's going to be different recommendations. It has information on there about the rating for mechanical control, or whether burning will have any effect on it, or whether a herbicide is really our best option. For example, if you look at this chart, if you look at Eastern Red Cedar, you can shows that it's a perennial and that it is mechanically controlled by cutting below the last green leaf, or the last green branch, and that it is controlled by burning if plants are small. And so that's important, versus maybe a broadleaf plant like buckbrush. We know that it too is a perennial, that it too can be controlled by herbicides, but that it's going to take repeated treatments with a herbicide, and it can even be controlled by mowing, but it's also going to take repeated mowings as well. So really good manual. If you want to learn a little bit more about some of those weeds, check that out. Again, request one of those through our local extension office or request one of those online. We can sure get you that. There's other resources available too. There's a book from University of Missouri that has nice pictures of weeds and even talks about some of the issues with some of those weeds, as well as control programs. So again, lots and lots of resources available that you can start to use so that you can start to devise a control program. One of the things that I referenced this spring in a couple of news columns is, the differences between plants, say like buckbrush, as I referenced earlier, and dogwood. Those plants are both broadleaf plants. They both have kind of a bushy growth appearance, multi-stem type of plants that can spread fairly easily. But buckbrush has to be controlled early, and dogwood doesn't have to be controlled later. So knowing the difference between those growth cycles and how those plants are going to mature or not mature is pretty important as we get ready to implement that control program. So let's talk about what that control program looks like. Now at the outset, I said that I really like the kind of an integrated management approach, if you will. And that basically means that we're going to try to at least consider multiple facets of control that we can implement. And so I've got 5 different facets of control I want to talk about. And the last one's going to be chemical, and we'll spend the most time on that. But let's start first with grazing management. Let's kind of go back to that just a little bit from what we talked about at the beginning. If we understand how a grass plant grows, then we understand that at some point that plant is best when it's only grazed to a certain height. We understand that it's best if that plant community has a chance for recovery during a set amount of time period, or at the very least that we allow plenty of regrowth so that that plant has enough photosynthetic capacity in the leaf area to kind of bring that plant back as it goes into the fall, and quite frankly to come back the next year. So grazing management is the first step. If we can implement a program that gives us every opportunity for that grass to be successful, then in many cases we give that grass a great chance to be competitive. Now that doesn't typically mean that if we get a weed infestation that just really pushing the grass is going to bring that back, at least not very quickly. But it does show us that if we can keep that grass community, those beneficial plants out there that we are trying to graze the animal on, that we can help to suppress those weeds to at least some degree. Remember I said earlier in the video that maybe up to 20% of a livestock diet could be forbs, maybe more if we're getting into animals like sheep and goats that we're grazing. And so knowing that, we know that we don't have to completely control everything, but if we start to look at that complement of forages and realize that maybe our grazing management is part of what is causing us a problem, then it might be time to fine-tune that a little bit. That comes in the way of what we're using for stocking rate, that comes in what we're doing for fertility, that comes even in season of use. So a good understanding of that, grazing management gives us the competitive advantage, if you will, from another plant out there that continually is trying to push those invasive species back. Second, mechanical control. Now, mechanical control, as I term it, is typically the mowing or the, running a brush hog through there. It's tree saws, it's shears, all those sorts of things that physically remove the plant in some way. Now, in many cases, if we have a resprouting species, any of our hedge, locust, any of those plants like that, then in most cases, we also need to add maybe some sort of chemical control, whether that be a post-foliar applied or a cut stump treatment. Those things have to be implemented with that physical control. Now, for brush hogging, something along those lines, again, we go back to that weed control guide, then we can see in there that some species work very well that way and others do not. From a weed standpoint, not brush, but from a weed standpoint, in many cases, we can at least prevent seed production. And if we mow it at the right time repeatedly, then in some cases, we can have good luck. If you look at the Missouri publication that I was talking about earlier from a weed control standpoint, it references in there that some of those weeds, like the ironweeds, for instance, multiple mowings throughout the season may do it some good. Now, whether we're able to do that or not depends, but it does show us that there are ways that we can do that, whether we're removing that whole tree completely or we're mowing the tops off to prevent those species from going to seed. Mechanical certainly has a place. Now, be advised that, again, mechanical doesn't work for every place. If you are to mow a cedar tree off too high and there's green branches below it, then in many cases it's just going to spread out and it's going to get worse and worse on you. And so sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't. The other caution that I would give you is anytime that you are doing a mowing type program, be careful that you don't mow too low. Now, some plants, quite frankly, if we're going to control them, we'd have to mow them low. But if that's going to harm the grass, and in many cases it can, if that's going to harm the grass, we don't want to do that, because the grazing management that we talked about for integrated management approach 1 is going to be reduced at that particular point. Perennial plants typically like when we mow them at the low point of their carbohydrate reserve cycle, when they're moving carbohydrates down to the roots. This is generally when they fully leafed out. Lots of times plants, if we can do that repeatedly, will do some good, but mechanical control can be tricky. So again, it is part of an integrated weed management approach, but it does have to be used with some caution. Number 3. Let's think about prescribed burning as an integrated management approach. Again, this approach has its place and in some cases does not. It is really best at controlling seedlings and sprouts. We're not going to do a very good job on very large trees unless it's in the case of an eastern red cedar and that fire happens to consume the whole thing. Then we can do some good. But in most cases, for deciduous species or weeds, we're not going to, in many cases, do a lot of good if those things are too tall. Quite frankly, it's difficult in our burning program to do a lot of good if we don't burn at the right time. And so when we have species that are resprouting, we might need to consider, burning over multiple years. We like to burn late if we can, because in many cases, some of those species aren't even out yet. And so we're not probably going to affect the growth of a species out there that is not even up and growing yet. That's why fire works really, really well in the warm season systems that we have in the Flint Hills of Kansas. Those work really well because we can burn those grasses just after they start to green up. They respond very well to that from both a nutrition and response standpoint. But we also have weeds that are out there growing, and we can beat those cool season weeds back at that point. For much of our cool season stands here in northeast Kansas, Bro and Fescue, we really have to burn those probably in mid-February to early March. And at that point, how many weeds are out? Not very many. Are there any trees that are really leafed out so that we are going to stress that tree and so that we set it back? No, not really. And so in many cases, we're not doing a whole lot to be able to affect that system in our cool season systems. We can even, in some cases, the cool season grasses just flat don't respond to fire like a warm season system will. And so in some cases, repeated burnings, especially at the wrong time, can actually set those stands back. So it is a place, it has a place. And certainly if you've got lots of little red cedars growing out there in an area, it can be a great opportunity to burn that and get those back in a timely manner. But again, our timing is going to have to be key on that, but it is still a part of that system. One thing I will tell you in regards to burning is make sure that you're always following your local burning regulations. Make sure that you know what those regulations are locally and that you have permission to conduct those burns if that is required. And also make sure that you personally have a burning plan in place, that you have plenty of help, that you have prepared for that burn in advance. It will make things a whole lot easier for you in the long run. Fourth facet of integrated weeds management is probably one of the smallest and least used, and that is the opportunity to use biological control. Now, when I talk about biological control, I'm talking like insects and diseases that maybe are going to biologically affect those plants that are out there and hopefully do some good at controlling them. Now, our options for biological control are not many. Just about every plant has an insect or a disease that will get it, but generally they aren't terribly widespread. So we have things like musk thistle head weevil that certainly have done some good over time, but generally they aren't, even close to 100% effective either. So what we tend to get is we have a weed issue that rears its ugly head, and then we introduce a biological control agent. And that biological control agent has an opportunity to feed, an opportunity to do what it needs to do, and hopefully, if it does a really good job of control, then its need to be there declines and it moves on to try and find another food source. And so biological control can be tricky. It often has to be re-implemented over time. Certainly in the case of something like the musk thistle head weevil, it can do some good over time, but again, it's probably not going to be your only method of control. The last facet of an integrated weed management program that I want to discuss is quite honestly the most popular, and that's chemical control. We like chemical control. We have good products out there. Companies have done a great job over the years of mixing products and even adding new products to lineups over the years. So we've got a really broad range of products. If you want a whole list of those, you can check out that KSU Chemical Weed Control Guide. It's got some really great information in it that can help you. It's even broken down by brush species, so you've got rates and everything like that in there. We'll put a link to that at the end of this presentation so you can take a peek at that. But that really gets broken down in that publication into about 4 or 5 different ways to treat those. The first is cut stump. Now, essentially what cut stump is after we've removed that stump, whether we cut it down, whether we shear it off, whatever we're doing, within the first 30 to 45 minutes, we want to apply a cut stump treatment. That's generally a mix of herbicide in a fairly high dose with either water or diesel fuel. It kind of depends on what formulation of product you're using. But those are applied to that cut stump area to keep it from resprouting. Very, very effective. Takes a little more product, but can be very, very effective over a lot of stumps in a short time. Basal bark is the second method of brush control that we typically use. But basal bark is just the treatment from the ground up to a height of about 18 to 24 inches of that trunk area. So we treat from that basal area of the crown all the way up to 18 to 24 inches and all the way around that trunk. If we do that, then we let that product soak in, and over time, then that tree kind of dies slowly. It can work really good if you've got trees that you want to kill and maybe make sure that they're dead before you cut them down. They use many of the same mixes that the cut stump treatments do, but obviously, rather than a cut stump area that's going to be one small flat area, you've got that whole area all the way up and down. Works best on smaller diameter trees, but certainly is an option if you've got a lot of plants out there that you want to at least start killing before you're able to cut them all down and do cut stump treatments. If you've got maybe a set of dogwood or something like that, and maybe you've got a lot of multi-stem plants out there and you just can't get to the other side of it, there are soil applied products as well, both liquid and pelletized type products that you can apply in those areas. They use water to leach them into the soil profile. They can work really, really effectively. They might damage some grass, but they can work really, really effectively and give you an option, especially again in those multi-stemmed clump type species where you just can't get in there very easily and do anything. Allows you to kind of take them out with a little bit more ease, but a couple of those products available as well. And then foliar application. Well, we really like the foliar application type of products, and there's a lot of them available out there, a lot of different active ingredients. Some of the most popular, obviously 2,4-D has been around a long time. Triclopyr products have been around for a long time as well. They're very effective. There's even some aminopyrrolid and metsulfuron products out there right now that are very, very effective. Now, the challenge with foliar application obviously gets to be coverage and also species. So we have to match a product at the right rate at the right time. And we do that by trying again to figure out when is that brush species going to be most effective. That is generally when it's young, fully leafed out, actively growing. The smaller the plant, the easier it is to get good coverage so that we can kill that plant. We want to get it again just after full leaf stage in the spring and not be waiting until into July and August. In many cases that plant is either stressed or some of those plants will get a really waxy covering on the leaf, and that prevents the herbicide from getting into the plant very easily. And so we want to make sure that we are doing that in a timely manner. Just as an example, buckbrush is fairly common in many of our pastures, but it's fairly easily controlled with foliar applications of 2,4-D. And we generally do that when that plant transitions from that light green color that it is when it first comes out to a darker green color as it starts to go into the latter part of the growing stages. So for buckbrush, Our best control comes from a simple application of a simple product that's been around forever, like 2,4-D, in late April or early May. Now, contrast that, however, with hedge. And we saw this in really stark contrast this year. All the buckbrush was out and growing. The hedge was still getting ready to leaf out, because hedge doesn't really leaf out until early June. And so those two programs are going to be mutually exclusive. If we want to control buckbrush, we've got to be out there in late April or early May. If we want to control hedge, then early June is our time frame. And so that means if we've got multi-species of brush out there, that we are going to probably have to do multi-applications, multiple passes, if we're going to do that right. Now, in many cases, we'll try to get that all in one shot. There's mixes out there that people have that mix 2 or 3 different products, and those are great and can do very good job. But just understand that those plants grow differently, and sometimes that's going to mean that they don't always respond as well as we'd like them to, because we're spraying them at different times. You run into also weed species are the same way, and that can complicate things even further. Maybe we're trying to spray for some brush species, and then we've got weeds out there as well. Those programs don't always work. We've mixed a lot of products over the years that are really good for general brush and weed control. Maybe they contain 2,4-D or triclopyr, or if we've got restricted use licensing, we can even use Tordon type products. But none of those products, except for the remedy or the triclopyr products, seem to work very well on Sericea. So we may do a very good job on all the other weeds out there, but we don't do a very good job on the Sericea because we don't have enough triclopyr in that mix. And so there's a balance that we have to have. And so if we are controlling those weeds, we really need to take a hard look at what products are going to control each one, and then do so specifically for those particular plants. Again, plants need to be actively growing. In many cases, we get to July and early August, and those plants just aren't doing that. So we have to be careful so that we get the best efficacy that we can out of those particular products as we get ready to apply. We've talked a lot about lots of different integrated weed management strategies, and I just want to reiterate just a little bit from the standpoint that, depending on what we are controlling, there is certainly a different need to get that controlled. Depending on how competitive that's going to be in the grass stand, noxious weeds certainly hold a special place, because we do have requirements to make sure that those are controlled. So as you put all those pieces together, make sure that you're trying to get something that you can prioritize. You can determine which of those plants are taking up the most space. A cedar tree, for example, really takes up a lot of space once it gets very tall, and so that may be a species that we want to get on really early. Same with plants like Sericea. They can be very invasive very quickly, can tie up a lot of grassland, and so we need to get on top of those plants that are doing us the worst, where in some cases we can get by with other methods, or fewer methods in some cases from an integrated standpoint, if those weeds aren't doing as much damage. So make sure that you understand what weeds you have out there and apply that integrated management approach. As we wrap this talk up, just a few words about products and how we use them. First of all, there are restricted use pesticides in Kansas. The Picloram products, the ones that are in Tordon, are some of those products. And so if you do not have a restricted use pesticide license, then you cannot purchase or apply those products. It's as simple as that. So if you are interested in getting your private pesticide applicator certification, then contact one of our offices and we'll sure get you details on that. But there's plenty of products out there to use. It just might be that in some cases you'll be missing a few of those if you don't have a restricted use pesticide license. Always read and follow the label direction. Those labels are there for your protection. Those labels are there so that we can get good control. Too often we might see a control program that doesn't work, and that's because in many cases that a label wasn't followed. In some cases we see off-site movement, and again, that may be because we didn't understand what that label was saying about how a particular product might move or what damage it could do to other things. So always read and follow that label direction. It is a law. It's up to you to know that. We can give you lots of recommendations as far as what rates to use, but that label is the law when it comes down to it. And if something works or doesn't work, and it's because of that label, then you're responsible for that. If you want more information about weed control programs, you want to request a copy of the Chemical Weed Control Guide, or just want to discuss what you might have and what needs to be done about that, you can check me out. Drop me a line at the email address below. We'd be glad to chat with you. You can also check us out at any of our K-State Research and Extension, Meadowlark Extension District offices. You can find that website address below so that you can do that. A link to the KSU Chemical Weed Control Guide is also included below. That is an awesome publication. Check that out. It will give you a wealth of information. And again, we're always here to help you as we can. We do appreciate you participating in our Tailgate Talk series as we continue this distance Tailgate Talk series. If you do have any questions, be sure you give us a call, and we appreciate you listening.